Now that we understand the request object, and we're still in debug mode from when we were examining the request object, now we're going to talk about the response object. Of course, the response object, or the RES, that's the name of the variable that holds the response object within an Express app. The response object is the object that represents the HTTP response that the Express application will be sending back to the client browser, or the client machine, application, mobile app, whatever it is. And this is going to be the HTTP response that is sent back to the user. It's what we use in order to send actual information back to the client. And in this response object, very similar to the request object, it actually holds all of the information about the response object that will be going back to the user across the internet. And there are key items in here, or key values that are important that we may or may not use depending upon what we're doing in response to a request. In here you can look at various different things in here. You can look at the connection and see the information about the connection that is being made or being sent back to the user. We can look at any locals that are available. We can look at the request itself. So that was the incoming request, which is right here. We've got the response information. Really, there's not much that we need to do with this unless we need to modify headers on our response object. Here you can see that X powered by Express. Well, we can add additional headers to our response if we need to pass back information or if we need to modify headers. If you recall the HTTP video where we went over headers and we looked at a response that came back from a server, it was the Neumont server, we got to kind of look and see what the response headers were that came back. In this case right now, we've really only got one header in there, and it just tells us what the system is that was generated the response that came back to the browser. And in this case, it's an Express application. Therefore, the response was generated by all of the underlying functionality that Express gives us. And there's really not much in here that we need to talk about when it comes to the response. The real part here is that when we do the response, we can use response.send to actually send information back to our client, the client that requested something to happen here. And so this is really important, that the response is how we send the information back to the user. And it's really the only thing we're going to worry about, or that we're going to use to begin with, are the send. I'm going to go ahead and break out of this really quick since we already looked at the object. We're going to be looking at the send function of the response, and then our index, also the router or the render function, which is what allowed us to use that view engine Jade to automatically compile HTML. And then also there is the function response.json, which is one that we're going to look at as well. And the response.json really is just the same as send. It just allows us to identify that we are sending full-blown JSON objects back rather than plain text or unencoded data. Instead, we're going to specify that it is JSON. And when we do this, the response type that is coming back to the client is going to be JSON rather than text or plain text or something like that. So this is a really brief overview of the response. It's really not quite as complex as the request, and most of the times we're just worried about response.json, response.send, and then response.render. Those are going to be the big methods that we're going to be using as we implement the Express application.